The security line stretched endlessly ahead of me as I watched David's retreating figure disappear around the corner toward gate B7. He hadn't even looked back. Not once. The weight of my carry-on bag suddenly felt unbearable as the reality sank in. My husband of 8 years had just abandoned me at Denver International Airport because I'd forgotten my passport in our hotel room. Forgotten, as if I was some scattered housewife who couldn't handle basic travel requirements. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ma'am, you need to move forward, the TSA agent called out, but I stood frozen watching other passengers flow around me like water around a stone. David's last words echoed in my mind. Natalie, I can't miss this meeting. Figure it out yourself for once. Figure it out myself. The condescension in his voice had cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. What David didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 8 years of marriage, was that I'd been figuring things out myself long before I ever met him. He'd dismissed my international relations degree as just academic theory, never asking about my thesis on diplomatic protocols or my internships. He'd reduced my language skills to cute party tricks and my cultural knowledge to random facts. As I stepped out of the security line, my phone buzzed with a text from David. Hotel front desk has your passport. Good luck getting home. No apology. No concern. Just dismissal. I smiled for the first time that morning. Good luck getting home indeed. Walking away from the security checkpoint, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd hoped never to use for personal reasons. Ambassador Patricia Williams answered on the second ring. Natalie Brooks, as I live and breathe. Patricia's warm voice filled the phone. Please tell me you're calling because you've finally decided to come back to diplomatic service. Patricia, I need a favor, I said, glancing around the busy terminal. I'm at Denver International and I need to get to Chicago immediately. My husband just left me stranded here. There was a long pause. Left you stranded? What kind of man leaves his wife stranded at an airport? The kind who thinks his management consulting meetings are more important than basic human decency. I replied, surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. Well, darling, you know I've been trying to get you back on my team for 5 years. Consider this a preview of the perk. Patricia's tone shifted to business mode. Terminal C, Gate 45. Look for the diplomatic services entrance. My assistant Marcus will meet you there in 20 minutes. We have a State Department flight heading to Chicago anyway. As I walked through the terminal, my mind wandered back to how David and I had met 9 years ago at a conference on international trade relations. I'd been presenting my research on emerging markets in Southeast Asia when this confident, well-dressed consultant had approached me after. He'd been charming, successful, and seemingly impressed by my expertise. Somewhere along the way, though, his admiration had turned into something else, something that made him feel threatened by my knowledge and connection. David's consulting firm, Stevens & Associates, specialized in helping companies navigate international expansions. What he'd never realized was that half his successful deals could have been closed faster and more efficiently if he'd simply asked his wife for guidance. I'd watched him struggle with cultural misunderstandings, protocol violations, and relationship-building challenges that I could have solved with a few phone calls, but David had never asked. In his mind, I was just his supportive wife who happened to speak 5 languages and understand international law. Marcus was waiting exactly where Patricia had promised, a distinguished man in his 50s, wearing a State Department badge. Mrs. Brooks, Ambassador Williams, sends her regard. If you'll follow me, we'll have you processed through diplomatic channels immediately. As we walked through a series of corridors I'd never seen before, Marcus made polite conversation. The ambassador mentioned you work together in Geneva. She speaks very highly of your contributions to the Southeast Asian trade agreements. That was a long time ago, I replied, though the pride in his voice reminded me why I'd loved that work so much. Perhaps not as long ago as you think. Marcus smiled knowing. The ambassador has kept your security clearance active, just in case, she said. We arrived at a discreet entrance marked Diplomatic Services Only. Beyond the doors was a world David had never seen, never even imagined. Comfortable seating areas, private security screening, and the quiet efficiency of people who understood the importance of international relations. This wasn't just about government officials. Diplomatic flights carried business leaders, cultural ambassadors, and academic researchers, all the people who kept the world connected and functioning. Your flight boards in 30 minutes, Marcus informed me, handing me a temporary diplomatic passport cover. Ambassador Williams insisted on upgrading your status for this trip. She said something about demonstrating what real problem-solving looks like. Sitting in the diplomatic lounge, I called Carmen, my closest friend and the only person who truly understood my frustration with David's dismissive attitude. Carmen had been my roommate during graduate school and had watched our relationship evolve from mutual respect to something much more one-sided. He actually left you at the airport? Carmen's voice rose an octave. Natalie, that's not just inconsiderate, that's cruel. The worst part is how unsurprised I am, I admitted. This is just the natural progression of 8 years of him treating me like an accessory to his success story. You know what I've never understood, Carmen continued. Why you've hidden your diplomatic background from his business circle. You could have opened doors for him that he can't even imagine. I'd asked myself the same question many times. The answer was complicated. Early in our marriage, I'd tried to contribute to David's business discussion. I'd mentioned contacts at foreign ministries, suggested cultural approaches to difficult negotiations, offered insights into international regulations. Each time, David had found a way to minimize my input or claim credit for my ideas. Eventually, I'd stopped trying. Maybe I was protecting myself, I said finally. If he didn't value my contributions, at least he couldn't steal them. The diplomatic flight to Chicago was everything David's cramped commercial airline experience would never be. Comfortable seating, personalized service, and fellow passengers who engaged in thoughtful conversations about international affairs. I found myself talking with Dr. Elizabeth Kim, a trade negotiator heading to a summit that would determine new Pacific Rim commerce standards. These protocols can make or break entire industries, Dr. Kim explained. One cultural misstep, one misunderstood gesture, and months of careful relationship building disappear. I nodded, thinking about David's recent complaints about a failed deal with a Japanese manufacturing company. He'd blamed their unreasonable demands and confusing business practices. I happened to know that the deal had fallen apart because David had violated several basic principles of Japanese business etiquette, including bringing up money too early in the relationship-building process and failing to show proper respect for the company's founding family. As we approached Chicago, I realized I was feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: professional excitement. The conversations on this flight had reminded me of who I was before I became David's wife. I was someone who understood how the world worked, who could navigate complex international relationships, who had spent years building a reputation for cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skill. My phone buzzed with another text from David. Landed safe. Assume you figured out the passport situation. See you tomorrow night. No question about whether I was okay. No concern about how I'd managed to solve the problem he'd created by abandoning me. Just the assumption that I'd handle it because I always handled things. I typed back. Problem solved. In Chicago now. Have a good meeting. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already called James Chen, my former colleague who now worked in private sector diplomatic consulting. James had always understood my expertise and had been asking me for years to consider returning to international work. When I'd called him from the diplomatic lounge, he'd practically shouted with excitement. Natalie, the timing is perfect, James had said. We're bidding on a massive contract to help Fortune 500 companies navigate the new Asian markets. Your background is exactly what we need. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I'd agreed without hesitation. Not because I was trying to spite David, but because for the first time in years, someone was valuing my actual skills rather than dismissing them. The car service that met me at Chicago's diplomatic arrival area was another reminder of the world I'd left behind. The driver, accustomed to transporting important officials, treated me with the professional courtesy that David's business associates reserved only for their male colleagues. As we drove through downtown Chicago toward my hotel, I reflected on how dramatically my day had changed. This morning, I'd been David's overlooked wife, someone whose forgotten passport was just another example of feminine incompetence. Tonight I was once again Natalie Brooks, international relations specialist, someone whose diplomatic passport commanded instant respect, and whose expertise opened doors that most people never even knew existed. The hotel where David was staying, the Grand Continental, was impressive by business travel standards, but they booked me into the diplomatic suite at the Palmer House, a much more prestigious accommodation, reserved for visiting officials and international dignitaries. The suite came with concierge services, priority restaurant reservations, and a level of personal attention that reflected my temporary diplomatic status. As I unpacked my single carry-on bag, I realized that everything I'd brought was perfectly appropriate for high-level business meetings. While David often criticized my wardrobe choices as too formal or overly professional, my instinct for diplomatic dressing meant I was always prepared for unexpected opportunities. That evening, I had dinner with James and his senior partners at Alinea, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. The conversation flowed seamlessly between international trade law, cultural negotiation strategies, and emerging market opportunity. For the first time in years, I was contributing meaningfully to business discussions, and my insights were being valued and built upon rather than dismissed. Your analysis of the Indonesian regulatory environment is exactly what the Henderson Industries contract needs, Margaret Walsh, the firm's managing partner, told me over dessert. We've been struggling to understand why their previous attempts at expansion failed so spectacularly. I smiled, thinking about David's upcoming meeting. Henderson Industries was exactly the client he'd been courting for 6 months, the deal he'd called career-defining. They were the reason he'd been willing to abandon me at the airport rather than miss tomorrow's presentation. Henderson's challenges aren't unusual, I explained. Most Western companies approach Indonesian markets with American or European assumptions about business relationships. But Indonesian culture prioritizes long-term relationship building and family-style trust development. Companies that try to fast-track deals inevitably fail. James leaned forward with interest. Would you be available to consult on this contract? We're presenting alternative strategies to Henderson next week. The irony was almost too perfect. David's most important potential client was about to hear proposals from his wife's new consulting team, the wife whose expertise he'd never valued, whose connections he'd never leveraged, whose diplomatic background he'd treated as an irrelevant academic curiosity. I'd be honored to help, I replied, and meant it completely. Walking back to my hotel that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: professional confidence. Not the nervous energy of trying to prove myself to David's dismissive colleagues, but the calm assurance of being recognized for what I actually knew and could accomplish. My phone rang as I reached my suite. David's name appeared on the screen. "How did you get to Chicago so fast?" he asked without preamble. "I thought you were stuck in Denver." "I found a solution," I replied simply. "What kind of solution?" "The next commercial flight wasn't until this evening." I looked out the window at Chicago's glittering skyline, thinking about how to answer. The truth was that I'd used resources David didn't even know existed, connections he'd never bothered to learn about, and professional relationships he'd spent years encouraging me to abandon. "The kind of solution you get when you understand how the world actually works," I said finally. There was a long pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing important, David. Just that some problems have solutions you haven't considered." "How's your preparation for tomorrow's meeting going?" "Fine. Henderson Industries is exactly the kind of client who can transform the firm. This deal could set us up for international expansion." But even now, after abandoning me at the airport, he still talked about his business success as a shared achievement. But his potential international expansion would happen without any input from the woman who'd spent her career understanding exactly those markets. "Well, I hope it goes well," I said sincerely. "International business can be tricky. Cultural understanding makes all the difference." "Right," David replied dismissively. "Anyway, I should get some sleep. See you tomorrow night." After he hung up, I sat in my elegant suite, thinking about the trajectory of our marriage. We'd started as intellectual equals, two ambitious people who respected each other's expertise. Somewhere along the way, David had decided that his practical business experience was more valuable than my theoretical knowledge. He'd gradually stopped asking for my opinions, stopped introducing me as someone with her own professional identity, stopped seeing me as anything more than a supportive wife who happened to be unusually well educated. Tomorrow would be interesting. David would walk into his career-defining meeting, confident in his preparation and his firm's capabilities. He'd have no idea that the competition had just gained access to 8 years' worth of expertise that he'd been sleeping next to every night while completely failing to recognize its value. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the materials James had sent about Henderson Industries' failed expansion attempts. Each case study was a textbook example of cultural misunderstanding and diplomatic incompetence, problems that could have been avoided with proper preparation and cultural sensitivity, problems that David's firm would undoubtedly repeat unless they fundamentally changed their approach to international business. As I worked late into the night, preparing recommendations that could save Henderson Industries millions of dollars and years of frustration, I realized I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it because it was the right thing to do, because I had knowledge that could help, and because finally someone was asking me to use my expertise for something that mattered. The abandoned wife at Denver International Airport felt like a different person already. Tomorrow, David would discover who his wife really was, and what resources she'd always had access to. Resources that could have made his business dreams come true, if only he'd been wise enough to ask. The next morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that only comes from having a clear purpose. I woke in my diplomatic suite at the Palmer House, feeling more energized than I had in months. Room service delivered fresh coffee and croissants, along with the morning financial reports that James had arranged to be sent up. Henderson Industries stock had dropped another 2 points overnight, following news of their latest failed expansion attempt in Thailand. Margaret Walsh had texted me at dawn with additional details about Henderson's upcoming decision. They were choosing between 3 consulting firms for their Asian market strategy, and the presentation scheduled for today would likely determine their direction for the next 5 years. David's firm Stevens & Associates was presenting at 10 in the morning. James's firm International Strategic Solutions would present at 2 in the afternoon. I spent the morning in my suite, preparing a comprehensive analysis that would demonstrate exactly why Henderson's previous attempts had failed, and how proper cultural intelligence could prevent future disaster. Each page I wrote felt like rediscovering a part of myself that had been dormant for too long. This was work that mattered, work that could prevent the kind of costly mistakes that destroyed both business relationships and cultural goodwill. My phone buzzed with a call from Carmen, who was following the day's events from her law office in Denver. "How are you feeling about today?" she asked. "Honestly, I feel like I'm finally doing what I was trained to do," I replied, reviewing a section on Indonesian business hierarchy protocol. "It's strange how natural this feels after years of pretending my expertise didn't matter." "David has no idea what's coming, does he?" I paused, considering the question. "David has no idea about most things, Carmen. He's spent so many years assuming he understands international business that he's never bothered to actually learn about it. Today might be educational for him." At exactly 9:45, I positioned myself in the lobby of the Henderson Industries building, a gleaming tower in Chicago's financial district. I wasn't there to spy on David's presentation, but I did want to observe his confidence level going in. James had suggested that understanding the competition's mindset would help our afternoon presentation. David arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed, and carrying the leather briefcase I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He walked with the confident stride of someone who believed success was simply a matter of professional preparation and personal charm. Mark Stevens, his senior partner, accompanied him along with 2 junior associates, whose nervous energy suggested they understood the stakes involved. I watched from behind a marble pillar as they checked in with building security and headed toward the elevators. David's posture radiated the kind of certainty that comes from never having your fundamental assumptions challenged. In his world, international business was simply domestic business conducted in different time zones. Cultural differences were obstacles to overcome, rather than relationships to understand. 45 minutes later, James texted me with intelligence from his contact inside Henderson Industries. David's presentation had gone exactly as expected. Professional slides, impressive revenue projections, and a timeline that promised rapid market entry with minimal cultural adaptation. The Henderson executives had listened politely and asked pointed questions about previous international failures that David's team had struggled to answer convincingly. They asked specifically about the Thai market collapse, James wrote. Stevens blamed regulatory complications and suggested that Henderson simply hadn't been aggressive enough in their expansion timeline. I shook my head, remembering the Thai situation from the news report. Henderson had attempted to enter the market using the same direct sales approach that worked in American suburban markets. They'd completely ignored the relationship-based business culture, skipped essential family introductions, and violated several subtle but crucial social protocols. The regulatory complications David mentioned were actually retaliatory responses to cultural insensitivity. At noon, I met with James and Margaret at their downtown offices to review our presentation materials one final time. Their conference room overlooked the same building where David was probably having lunch with his team, celebrating what he likely assumed was a successful morning. "Your cultural analysis section is extraordinary," Margaret said, flipping through my recommendation. "This level of detail about family business structures and generational decision-making processes is exactly what Henderson needs to understand." James nodded enthusiastically. The section on gift-giving protocols alone could save them from the kind of mistakes that killed their Vietnam expansion. David's firm probably doesn't even know those protocols exist. As we walked toward Henderson Industries for our afternoon presentation, I felt the familiar excitement of knowing I was prepared for something important. This wasn't nervous energy or imposter syndrome. This was the calm confidence of someone who had spent years developing expertise that was finally being recognized and utilized. The Henderson Industries boardroom was elegant in an understated way, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Robert Henderson himself led the executive team, a distinguished man in his 60s, whose family had built the company from a small manufacturing operation into a multinational corporation. Beside him sat his daughter Victoria, who served as VP of International Development, and 3 senior executives, whose body language suggested they'd been burned by too many failed expansion attempts. "Brooks," Robert Henderson said as introductions were made, "Margaret tells me you have extensive experience in Southeast Asian markets. We're particularly interested in understanding why our previous attempts haven't succeeded." I opened my presentation materials feeling completely in my element for the first time in years. "Mr. Henderson, your company's products are excellent, and your domestic success speaks to strong business fundamentals. The challenges you've faced internationally aren't about product quality or market demand. They're about relationship architecture. In American business culture, we often approach new markets with a transaction-first mentality," I explained. "We identify potential customers, present our products, negotiate terms, and expect to close deals based on competitive advantage. This approach works in cultures that share our business assumptions." I clicked to my first slide, which showed a map of Henderson's failed expansion attempts. But in family-oriented business cultures like those throughout Southeast Asia, relationship-first approaches are essential. Before anyone considers your products, they need to understand your family, your values, and your commitment to long-term partnership. Robert Henderson nodded slowly. The consulting firm we heard from this morning emphasized speed and efficiency. They suggested that cultural adaptation was less important than market penetration. That approach guarantees failure in relationship-based markets, I replied directly. It's not just culturally insensitive, it's financially irresponsible. Your Thailand expansion failed because your representatives violated family honor protocols before they ever had a chance to present your products. For the next hour, I walked the Henderson team through detailed analyses of their previous expansion attempts, explaining exactly where cultural misunderstandings had derailed promising business relationships. Each case study demonstrated how proper cultural preparation could have prevented expensive failures and built lasting partnerships instead. Your Vietnam expansion collapsed when your negotiating team brought up pricing during the first meeting, I explained. In Vietnamese business culture, discussing money before establishing personal trust is equivalent to announcing that you view them as transactions, rather than partners. Victoria Henderson was taking extensive notes. How long should relationship building take before business discussions begin? That depends on the specific culture and the scale of the partnership you're proposing, I replied. But generally, you should expect to invest 3 to 6 months in relationship development before substantive business negotiations can begin. This isn't wasted time. It's the foundation that makes everything else possible. Margaret jumped in with specific examples from our other clients. Companies that invest properly in cultural relationship building typically see much higher success rates and longer-lasting partnerships. The upfront time investment pays for itself many times over. As our presentation continued, I could see the Henderson executives beginning to understand why their previous approaches had failed so consistently. This wasn't about their products or their pricing or their market research. This was about fundamental assumptions regarding how business relationships develop and function. The most successful American companies in Asian markets are those that embrace relationship-first approaches. I conclude, they send representatives who speak the local languages, understand family business structures, and are prepared to invest significant time in trust building before any transactions occur. Robert Henderson sat back in his chair, processing what he'd heard. Mr. Brooks, this analysis makes our previous failures seem almost inevitable. How do we know that your firm can help us avoid these mistakes going forward? James answered smoothly. Miss Henderson, Natalie has spent her career building exactly the kinds of relationships that successful expansion requires. She has personal connections with business leaders throughout Southeast Asia, and more importantly, she understands how to transfer that relationship-building capability to your team. I'm not just proposing theoretical solutions, I add. I'm offering to facilitate introductions with established business families who are actively seeking American partners. These are relationships that have taken years to develop, and they're available to Henderson Industries because we understand the proper protocols for business family introductions. Victoria Henderson looked up from her notes. What kind of timeline would proper market entry require? 18 months for sustainable market presence in your priority markets, I replied. 6 months for relationship development, 6 months for pilot program implementation, and 6 months for scale-up based on partnership feedback. This timeline assumes proper cultural preparation and relationship investment. The room fell quiet as the Henderson team considered this approach. Finally, Robert Henderson spoke. The other consulting firm promised market entry within 6 months and significant revenue within the first year. Mr. Henderson, I said carefully, that timeline assumes American business cultural norms in markets that don't operate according to those norms. You've tried similar approaches 3 times now, and each attempt has failed expensive. Fast timelines and relationship-based markets are fundamentally incompatible. Margaret added, our recommended approach takes longer up front, but it builds partnerships that last for decades, rather than deals that collapse within months. After our presentation concluded, the Henderson executives asked to speak privately for a few minutes. James, Margaret, and I waited in an adjacent conference room while they discussed our proposal. That went better than I expected. James said quietly. They were really engaging with the cultural analysis. The contrast with this morning's presentation must be significant, Margaret observed. Speed and efficiency versus relationship and sustainability. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Henderson meeting went great. Think we really impressed them with our aggressive timeline. Should hear back tomorrow. I stared at the message, thinking about how differently we'd each interpreted the opportunity that Henderson Industries represented. David saw a client who needed fast results and efficient execution. I saw a company that had been making the same expensive mistakes repeatedly because they'd never addressed the fundamental cultural assumptions underlying their approach. When the Henderson executives invited us back into the boardroom, their body language had shifted noticeably. Robert Henderson looked directly at me as he spoke. Ms. Burks, your analysis has helped us understand why we've struggled internationally despite our domestic success. We'd like to move forward with international strategic solutions, with the understanding that you'll be personally involved in our Southeast Asian expansion planning. Victoria Henderson added, We're particularly interested in the relationship facilitation you mentioned. Having access to established business family networks could accelerate our relationship building significantly. As we shook hands and discussed next steps, I felt the satisfaction of being valued for my actual expertise, rather than dismissed as an academic theorist. This was work that matched my training and experience, work that could create meaningful positive outcomes for everyone involved. Walking out of the Henderson Industries building with James and Margaret, I realized that my professional life was about to change dramatically. For 8 years I'd been David's supportive wife, whose international knowledge was treated as an interesting hobby. Starting today, I would be leading Henderson Industries' expansion into markets where my expertise and relationships were essential for success. "Natalie," Margaret said as we reached the street, "I hope you'll consider joining our firm permanently. This kind of cultural intelligence consulting is exactly where international business is heading." James nodded enthusiastic. "The Henderson contract alone will require at least 2 years of intensive cultural preparation and relationship facilitation. We need someone with your background leading that effort." I looked back up at the Henderson Industries building, thinking about how radically my day had changed from this morning's preparation to this afternoon's success. Somewhere in that building, executives were probably calling other consulting firms to inform them that their services wouldn't be needed, including Stevens and Associates. My phone rang as we reached the parking garage. David's name appeared on the screen. "Natalie, the strangest thing just happened," he said without greeting. "Henderson Industries just called to tell us they're going with a different consulting firm, some company called International Strategic Solutions." I glanced at James, who was trying not to smile. "That's disappointing, David. I know how much that contract meant to you. The weird part is, they specifically mentioned wanting someone with deeper cultural expertise for their Asian expansion. Mark thinks they got spooked by the complexity and chose to go with a more conservative approach." Conservative. I almost laughed at David's interpretation. Maybe they just wanted someone who understood the markets they're trying to enter. Right. But how much cultural knowledge do you really need for business? People are people, and good products sell themselves if you present them professionally. 8 years of marriage, and David still had no idea how fundamentally wrong that assumption was. "I'm sure you'll find other opportunities, David. Maybe this just wasn't the right fit." "Yeah, maybe," he said, though his disappointment was obvious. "Anyway, I'll be flying back tomorrow morning. See you tomorrow night." After hanging up, I stood in the parking garage, thinking about the strange symmetry of the day. This morning, David had been confident about his chances with Henderson Industries, while I was preparing materials that would ultimately win the contract he wanted. This evening he was disappointed about losing an opportunity while I was celebrating the beginning of a new career phase. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's career-defining opportunity had just become exactly that, but not in the way he'd anticipated. His failure to secure the Henderson contract wasn't due to bad luck or unfair competition. It was the natural result of approaching complex international markets with oversimplified assumptions and inadequate preparation. Meanwhile, my success with Henderson Industries wasn't about revenge or proving a point to David. It was about finally being able to use my expertise for something meaningful. Something that could help prevent the kinds of costly cultural mistakes that damaged both business relationships and international goodwill. James drove me back to my hotel, and we spent the ride discussing the next steps for the Henderson project. Contract negotiations, team assembly, travel schedules for relationship-building trips, and timeline development for sustainable market entry. Real work that matched my training and experience. "Natalie," James said as we pulled up to the Palmer house, "I have to ask, how long has your husband been dismissing your international expertise?" I considered the question carefully, probably since about year 2 of our marriage. Once David decided that practical business experience was more valuable than academic knowledge, he stopped seeing my background as relevant to anything that mattered. "His loss is definitely our gain," James replied. "But still, 8 years of living with someone who understands international markets and never bothering to learn from them, that's remarkable short-sightedness." That evening, I had dinner alone in my suite, reviewing the contract materials that Margaret had sent over. Real consulting work with real clients who valued cultural expertise and relationship-building capability. Work that could make a genuine difference in how American companies approached international expansion. As I worked late into the night, preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging and rewarding professional phase of my career, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 2 days. The woman David had abandoned at Denver International Airport had been his overlooked wife, whose forgotten passport was just another example of feminine incompetence. The woman who had just secured Henderson Industries' most important consulting contract was someone else entirely, someone whose diplomatic background opened doors that most people never even knew existed, someone whose cultural expertise could save companies millions of dollars and years of frustration, someone who had always possessed these capabilities, but had simply been married to a man too limited in his own assumptions to recognize their value. Tomorrow I would fly back to Denver and begin the process of rebuilding my professional identity around work that actually mattered. David would return from his disappointing business trip, probably expecting sympathy for his lost opportunity and support for whatever new venture he decided to pursue next. What he would find instead was a wife who had remembered what she was capable of accomplishing when her expertise was valued rather than dismissed. The abandoned wife at the airport had been a temporary. The international consulting specialist who had just won a multi-million-dollar contract was who I had always been underneath. The question now was whether David would be able to adapt to living with someone whose professional success no longer depended on his approval or support. Someone who had her own career trajectory, her own client relationships, and her own reasons for traveling to international destinations. Someone who had finally stopped figuring things out for him and started figuring them out for herself. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my new corner office at International Strategic Solutions, reviewing travel itineraries for my first Henderson Industries relationship-building trip to Jakarta, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for Stevens & Associates, David's firm. Mark Stevens himself was calling, which surprised me since he'd always treated me as merely David's wife, rather than someone worthy of direct professional contact. "Natalie, I hope you don't mind me calling directly." Mark's voice carried an unusual note of desperation. "I was wondering if we could meet for coffee sometime this week. There's a business matter I'd like to discuss with you." I glanced at my calendar, which was packed with Henderson Industries preparation meetings, cultural briefing sessions, and calls with my contacts in Southeast Asia. "I'm quite busy with a new project, Mark." "What kind of business matter?" "Well, it's somewhat delicate." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "We've been hearing about your work with Henderson Industries, and frankly, we're curious about your background in international consulting. David never mentioned that you had expertise in this area." I almost laughed out loud. 8 years of marriage, countless dinner conversations about David's business challenges, and Mark Stevens was just now discovering that I had relevant professional experience. "David tends to focus on his own work rather than mine. What specifically did you want to discuss?" "Stevens & Associates is exploring opportunities in international markets, and we're realizing that our approach might benefit from cultural expertise. We were hoping you might be available for some consulting work." The irony was breathtaking. David's firm was essentially asking me to help them develop the exact capabilities that had cost them the Henderson contract. Capabilities I'd offered informally for years, through dinner table conversations that David had consistently dismissed as academic theorizing. "Mark, I appreciate the interest, but International Strategic Solutions keeps me quite busy. Perhaps you should consider hiring someone with international business development experience on a permanent basis." "Actually, that's exactly what we're hoping to discuss. A permanent position with our firm, senior partner level, international division head. We're prepared to offer very competitive compensation." I set down my pen and gave Mark my full attention. Stevens & Associates was offering me a senior partnership in the firm that had just lost their biggest potential contract to my cultural The firm where my husband worked, where I'd been treated as a decorative spouse for 8 years, was now trying to recruit me as their salvation. "That's a significant offer, Mark." Can I ask what prompted this sudden interest in international capabilities? Honestly, we've lost 3 major opportunities this quarter to firms that specialize in cultural intelligence consulting. Our clients are increasingly interested in expanding into Asian and Latin American markets, and we're not equipped to help them succeed in those environments. 3 major opportunities. I wondered if David was aware that his firm's struggles extended far beyond the Henderson contract, or if he was still attributing their problems to bad luck and market conditions. I see. Well, I'll need to think about it carefully. My current project requires significant international travel and relationship management. Can you send me details about what you're envisioning? After Mark hung up, I stared out my office window at downtown Denver's skyline, processing the conversation. 6 months ago, I'd been David's overlooked wife whose expertise was treated as irrelevant hobby knowledge. Today, David's own firm was desperately trying to recruit me to save their failing business model. Carmen knocked on my office doorframe, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd been eavesdropping. Was that really Mark Stevens begging you to save their company? Essentially, yes, I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. They want to hire me as senior partner to head up their new international division. The same international division they've never had, because they thought cultural knowledge was unnecessary academic fluff. The very same. Apparently, losing multiple clients to culturally competent competitors has clarified their thinking about the value of international expertise. Carmen settled into the chair across from my desk, grinning widely. Are you going to tell David that his firm just tried to recruit his wife to fix their problems? I hadn't considered that aspect of the situation. David still had no idea that his wife was the cultural consultant who'd won the Henderson contract away from Stevens and Associates. In his mind, some unknown competitor with mysteriously superior cultural knowledge had simply outbid his firm for unclear reason. I think I'll let him figure it out on his own, I said finally. David's very confident about his analytical abilities. I'm sure he'll piece together the connection eventually. That evening, David came home unusually subdued. His typical post-work energy was replaced by the deflated demeanor of someone whose professional confidence had taken several recent hits. He poured himself a Scots and sat heavily in his leather recliner, staring at his phone with obvious frustration. Rough day, I asked, settling into the opposite chair with my own glass of wine. Rough month, actually, David replied without looking up. We lost another major client today. International Expansion Consulting. They said they were looking for someone with deeper cultural expertise. I nodded sympathetically. That seems to be a common theme lately. Maybe the market is shifting toward more specialized approaches. Maybe, David said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. Mark thinks we need to hire someone with international experience, someone who understands cultural protocols and relationship development. It took a sip of wine, waiting to see if David would make any connections. That sounds like a reasonable response to market demand. The problem is finding someone with the right background who's available. Mark called some woman today, someone who's apparently working with Henderson Industries now. She turned us down, said she was too busy with her current projects. After 8 years of marriage, David's own business partner had contacted me directly for professional consultation. And David still didn't realize that the international expert they were trying to recruit was his wife. What kind of background were you looking for? I asked. Cultural intelligence, diplomatic experience, language skills, established relationships in Asian markets, basically someone who can help our clients avoid the kind of mistakes that derail international expansions. I set down my wine glass and looked directly at David. Darling, you do realize that I have all of those qualifications, don't you? David glanced up from his phone for the first time since coming home. What do you mean? I mean, I have advanced degrees in international relations and cultural studies. I speak 5 languages fluently. I spent 3 years working in diplomatic services with Southeast Asian governments. I have personal relationships with business leaders throughout Asia. I've been sitting across the dinner table from you for 8 years listening to you struggle with exactly the kind of cultural challenges that my education and experience were designed to solve. The room fell completely silent. David stared at me as if I'd just revealed that I was secretly a foreign agent. But you work in academic research. I work in academic research. Because you've spent our entire marriage treating my practical experience as irrelevant hobby knowledge. Every time I've tried to contribute to your business discussions, you've dismissed my input as theoretical and impractical. David's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like panic. Wait, you're saying you could have helped with our international consulting challenges this whole time, David? I tried to help, many times. Remember when you were struggling with that Japanese manufacturing deal last year? I suggested specific cultural protocols that would have demonstrated respect for their family business structure. You told me that real business success came from efficiency and directness, not cultural accommodation. I could see David's mind working, trying to process the implications of what I was telling him. But if you have that kind of expertise, why didn't you push harder to get involved? Because you made it very clear that my contributions weren't valued or wanted. Eventually I stopped offering input that was going to be dismissed anyway. David stood up abruptly and began pacing around the living room. This doesn't make sense, Natalie. If you had relevant business experience, why wouldn't you have pursued consulting work before? Who said I haven't pursued consulting work? I replied quietly. David stopped pacing and turned to face me. What do you mean? I mean that after you abandoned me at Denver International Airport, I remembered what I was capable of when my expertise was actually valued. I've spent the last month working with International Strategic Solutions on international expansion consulting. International Strategic Solutions, David repeated slowly. That's the firm that won the Henderson contract, yes. It is. David's face went through several different expressions as the full scope of the situation became clear to him. You're the cultural consultant who beat our proposal for Henderson Industries. I'm the cultural consultant who provided Henderson Industries with the kind of analysis they needed to understand why their previous expansion attempts had failed consistently. The kind of analysis that Stevens and Associates wasn't equipped to provide. David sank back into his chair, staring at me with something approaching horror. You deliberately sabotaged our Henderson proposal. I didn't sabotage anything, David. I simply offered Henderson Industries better consulting services than your firm was capable of providing. Services based on years of education and experience that you've spent our marriage dismissing as irrelevant. But you knew how important that contract was to me, to the firm. How could you compete against us? I stood up, feeling a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. How could I compete against you? David, you abandoned me at an airport security checkpoint because I'd forgotten my passport. You walked away from your wife and told me to figure out my own transportation home. You've spent 8 years treating my expertise as worthless academic theory while struggling with business challenges that I could have solved easily. How could I compete against you? The better question is how you could treat me so poorly that competing against you felt like professional growth rather than personal betrayal. David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he seemed to understand that he was in the wrong, and that standard damage control techniques weren't going to work. I need to think about this, he said finally, standing up and heading toward his study. Take all the time you need, I replied. I'll be in Jakarta next week, building business relationships with Henderson Industries' potential partners, real cultural relationship development that will take months to establish properly. The next morning, I was in my office early reviewing final preparations for the Jakarta trip when James knocked on my doorframe. How's the Henderson cultural briefing coming along? Extremely well, I replied, showing him the detailed relationship maps I'd prepared. I've confirmed meetings with 4 established business families who are actively seeking American manufacturing partners. These aren't cold calls or networking events. These are warm introductions based on relationships I've maintained for years. James whistled appreciatively. This level of relationship access is exactly why Henderson chose us over the competition. By the way, Margaret mentioned that Stevens and Associates called yesterday asking about your availability for consulting work. Mark Stevens offered me a senior partnership position heading up their international division, their non-existent international division, James corrected with a grin. Are you considering it? I thought about David's reaction to discovering that his wife was the mysterious cultural consultant who'd been out competing his firm. I don't think Stevens and Associates and I would be a good cultural fit. They're still operating under the assumption that international business is simply domestic business conducted in different languages. Their loss is definitely our gain. The Henderson Project alone will establish us as the premier cultural intelligence consulting firm in the region. We've already had 3 new client inquiries based on word of mouth from the Henderson executives. That afternoon, I received a call from Victoria Henderson asking if I could expedite our Jakarta relationship building timeline. We've been contacted by 2 other consulting firms claiming they can get us into Asian markets faster than your 18-month timeline, she explained. One firm promised market entry within 6 months. I wasn't surprised. David's firm and their competitors were probably scrambling to develop international capabilities in response to losing multiple contracts to culturally competent firms. Victoria, I can absolutely accelerate our timeline, but it would require shortcuts that compromise the relationship-building foundation we discussed. Fast market entry and sustainable partnerships are mutually exclusive in relationship-based culture. That's exactly what I wanted to hear, Victoria replied with obvious relief. The other firms seemed to think that cultural adaptation was just a matter of translating marketing materials and hiring local sales staff. Cultural adaptation is about understanding how business relationships develop and function in different cultural contexts. It's not a translation problem, it's a relationship architecture problem. After hanging up with Victoria, I realized that Stevens and Associates was probably one of the firms promising Henderson Industries faster market entry. David was likely trying to win back the contract by offering exactly the kind of aggressive timeline that had caused Henderson's previous expansion failures. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Can we talk when you get home tonight? There are things I need to understand about your consulting work." I typed back, "Of course, I should be home by 7. That evening, David was waiting in the living room with a notepad and the focused expression he usually reserved for important business analysis. "Natalie, I've been thinking about everything you told me last night, and I need to understand how I missed something so significant about your background." I sat down across from him, curious about his approach to this conversation. "What would you like to know?" "Start with your education. I know you have advanced degrees, but I never understood what they prepared you to do professionally." "My master's degree is in international relations with a focus on Southeast Asian political and economic systems. My doctoral coursework was in cultural anthropology with emphasis on business relationship development in family-oriented society. My dissertation research involved 3 years of fieldwork in Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, studying how American companies could build successful partnerships with established business families." David was taking notes as I spoke. "And your diplomatic experience?" "After graduate school, I worked for 3 years with the State Department's Commercial Services Division. My job was helping American businesses navigate cultural protocols for international expansion. I developed relationships with business leaders throughout Southeast Asia and learned how to facilitate introductions between American companies and established foreign partners." "Why did you leave diplomatic service?" I considered how to answer that question honestly. "I left because I met you and thought I wanted to focus on academic research while supporting your business career. I thought being a supportive wife was more important than pursuing my own professional ambitions." David set down his pen and looked directly at me. "And I never encouraged you to use that background professionally, David. You actively discouraged me from pursuing international consulting work. Every time I mentioned business opportunities that my diplomatic contacts brought to my attention, you told me that my academic background wasn't relevant to real business challenges." "I was wrong," David said quietly. "Clearly, demonstrably wrong. Your expertise is exactly what Stevens and Associates needs to compete in international markets." I waited to see where this conversation was heading. "Natalie, I know that Mark offered you a partnership position, and I know you turned it down, but I need to ask personally. Would you consider joining Stevens and Associates to lead our international division? Not as a favor to me, but as a genuine business partnership." I studied David's face, trying to understand whether this request came from personal desperation or professional recognition. "David, Your firm has spent years operating under assumptions that are fundamentally incompatible with successful international consulting. Building real cultural intelligence capabilities isn't just a matter of hiring someone with the right background. It requires changing how you think about relationship development, timeline expectations, and success metrics. I understand that. We're prepared to restructure our entire approach to international consulting based on your expertise. Are you prepared to lose clients who want fast results rather than sustainable partnerships? Are you prepared to invest months in relationship development before any revenue generation? Are you prepared to accept that some business cultures require approaches that seem inefficient by American standards? David nodded slowly. If that's what successful international consulting requires, then yeah. I sat back in my chair, processing David's apparent willingness to adapt his firm's approach to international markets. David, I appreciate the offer, but I'm already committed to International Strategic Solutions and the Henderson Industries project. That project alone will require 2 years of intensive relationship management. What would it take to change your mind? The question surprised me with its directness. Honestly, nothing. International Strategic Solutions values my expertise and gives me the professional autonomy to do culturally appropriate consulting work. Stevens and Associates would need to prove that they'd fundamentally changed their approach to international business, and that kind of cultural transformation takes years to accomplish. David's shoulders sagged slightly. So there's nothing I can do to convince you to help save the firm. Save the firm? I repeated. David, how bad are Stevens and Associates' problems? Bad enough that we might not survive without developing international capabilities quickly. We've lost 6 major clients this quarter to competitors with cultural intelligence consulting capability. Our domestic market is saturated, and international expansion is the only growth opportunity available. I realized that David's firm was facing much more serious challenges than I'd understood. Have you considered partnering with established international consulting firms rather than trying to build capabilities internally? We've explored that option, but partnership arrangements give us less control over client relationships and profit margin. I looked at my husband, recognizing the same analytical mindset that had led Stevens and Associates to lose multiple international contracts. David, successful international consulting is fundamentally about relationship management rather than profit optimization. If you're primarily concerned with control and margins, you're approaching international markets with exactly the wrong priorities. David was quiet for several minutes, staring at his notepad. Finally, he looked up at me with something resembling resignation. Natalie, I think I'm beginning to understand why you've been successful with Henderson Industries and why we've been failing with similar clients. What do you think you understand? I think I understand that international business success requires approaches that I've never learned and assumptions that I've never questioned. I think I understand that your expertise is exactly what our clients need, and exactly what I've been too limited to recognize. I nodded. That's a good starting point for developing actual cultural intelligence capabilities. Will you at least consider consulting for Stevens and Associates on a project basis? Not a permanent position, but specific international projects where we need cultural I thought about David's request carefully. Working with Stevens and Associates would mean working directly with my husband in a professional capacity for the first time in our marriage. It would also mean helping the firm that had lost the Henderson contract due to cultural incompetence. I'll consider project-based consulting after I return from Jakarta, I said finally, but any arrangement would need to be structured as a business partnership between International Strategic Solutions and Stevens and Associates. I won't work directly for your firm. David nodded eagerly. That would be acceptable. Margaret Walsh has a good reputation for international consulting partnerships. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with David was changing. For 8 years, he'd been the successful business professional, while I'd been the supportive wife with interesting academic credentials. Now, he was asking me to save his failing firm using exactly the expertise he'd spent our marriage dismissing as irrelevant. The woman who'd been abandoned at Denver International Airport would have been thrilled by David's recognition and eager to help rescue his business. The woman who'd spent the last month building her own consulting career was more cautious about mixing personal and professional relationships. Tomorrow, I would fly to Jakarta to begin relationship development work that could transform Henderson Industries' approach to international expansion. Real work that matched my training and experience, work that would establish lasting business partnerships based on cultural understanding and mutual respect. David would spend tomorrow trying to convince Stevens and Associates partners that their firm's survival depended on developing capabilities they'd previously considered unnecessary academic theory. His success would depend on his ability to recognize that international business required fundamentally different approaches than domestic consulting. Whether our marriage could survive the transition from husband as primary breadwinner to wife as international business expert remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I was more interested in my own professional development than in supporting David's career ambitions. The balance of power in our relationship had shifted permanently, and both of us were still learning how to navigate the new dynamic. The Jakarta business district gleamed in the morning sunlight as my driver navigated through the bustling streets toward the first of what would be 5 crucial meetings over the next 3 days. Each meeting represented years of careful relationship cultivation, connections that could transform Henderson Industries' approach to Southeast Asian markets, from repeated failure to sustainable success. Sitting in the back seat of the comfortable sedan, I reviewed my notes one final time. Today's schedule included introductions with the Suharto family's manufacturing consortium, the Chen Business Group's distribution network, and the Prabowo family's retail operations. These weren't cold sales calls or networking events. These were warm reintroductions between old friends who happened to control some of Indonesia's most influential business operations. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Walsh. David called this morning asking about our Jakarta timeline. Seems unusually interested in Henderson project specifics. Everything okay on the home front? I typed back quickly. David's firm lost Henderson contract to us. He's recently discovered his wife was lead consultant on winning proposal, adjusting to new reality. Margaret's response was immediate. Holy hell, Natalie, he didn't know you were working on Henderson. This must be awkward. Awkward was an understatement. David had spent the past week oscillating between embarrassment about missing his wife's expertise and frustration about losing business to someone he'd lived with for 8 years without truly understanding. Last night's phone call before my departure had been particularly tense. I still don't understand how this happened, David had said, pacing around our bedroom as I packed for Jakarta. How did I miss that you were working on the exact contract that could have saved our international consulting division? You missed it because you've spent 8 years assuming that my professional background was irrelevant to real business challenges, I'd replied, folding cultural appropriate business attire for the Indonesian meeting. When Mark Stevens called me directly for consulting work, you didn't even recognize my name as someone worth investigating, but you deliberately didn't tell me you were competing for Henderson. I'd stopped packing and looked directly at him. David, I didn't deliberately anything. I took a consulting assignment with a firm that valued my expertise. The fact that Henderson Industries was considering multiple consulting firms wasn't my concern. My concern was providing the best possible cultural analysis for my client. The conversation had ended with David storming out to his study and me finishing my packing in blessed silence. This morning he'd left for work before I woke up, avoiding the awkwardness of a goodbye that neither of us knew how to navigate. Now, halfway around the world from David's wounded pride and Stevens and Associates' financial troubles, I was doing the work I'd trained for years to accomplish. Real cultural relationship facilitation that could create lasting business partnerships based on mutual respect and understanding. The Suharto family's office building occupied an entire city block, its traditional Indonesian architectural elements seamlessly integrated with modern glass and steel. Walking through the marble lobby toward the executive elevators, I felt the familiar excitement of entering a space where cultural protocols mattered more than American-style efficiency. Budi Suharto met me personally in the reception area outside his corner office, a gesture of respect that most American business executives would never understand the significance of. In Indonesian business culture, having the family patriarch greet visitors personally indicated both the importance of the relationship and the serious nature of the business being discussed. Natalie, it has been too long, Budi said in perfect English, though I responded in Indonesian out of courtesy. Our conversation flowed seamlessly between languages as we caught up on family developments, mutual friends, and recent changes in the Indonesian business environment. I understand you are representing Henderson Industries now, Budi said as we settled into comfortable chairs overlooking Jakarta's skyline. Robert Henderson has an excellent reputation for quality manufacturing and ethical business practice. Henderson Industries is very interested in developing long-term partnerships with established Indonesian business families, I replied. They understand that sustainable success in Indonesian markets requires relationship-first approaches rather than transaction-focused strategy. Budi nodded approvingly. Too many American companies approach our markets with aggressive timelines and profit expectations that ignore relationship development requirements. These approaches always fail expensively. I pulled out my prepared materials showing Henderson Industries' domestic success record and their commitment to cultural adaptation for Indonesian market entry. Henderson's leadership recognizes that their previous international expansion failures resulted from insufficient cultural preparation. They're prepared to invest 18 months in relationship development before expecting any significant revenue generation. 18 months is appropriate for building family business trust, Budi agreed. Most American companies expect results within 6 months and become frustrated when relationship development takes longer than their patience allows. We spent the next hour discussing specific protocols for introducing Henderson Industries to the broader Soeharto business network, timeline expectations for trust development, and cultural considerations for long-term partnership agreements. Budi's enthusiasm for Henderson's relationship-focused approach was obvious, and by the meeting's end, he'd agreed to facilitate introductions with 3 other major Indonesian business families. As I left the Soeharto offices, my phone rang with a call from Victoria Henderson. Natalie, how did the first meeting go? Extremely well, I replied, walking toward my next appointment. Budi Soeharto has agreed to facilitate broader network introductions, and he's impressed by Henderson Industries' commitment to proper relationship development timeline. That's wonderful news. I have to ask though, we received another proposal this morning from Stevens and Associates. They're claiming they can accelerate our Indonesian market entry using established business connections. Should we be concerned that we're missing opportunities by waiting for relationship development? I stopped walking, processing what Victoria had just told me. Stevens and Associates was apparently claiming to have the exact capabilities that had led Henderson Industries to choose International Strategic Solutions. Victoria, can you tell me specifically what Stevens and Associates is promising regarding Indonesian business connections? They claim to have access to established Indonesian business families through a senior partner with diplomatic experience and cultural expertise. They're promising market entry within 8 months using these existing relationships. The audacity was breathtaking. David's firm was essentially claiming to possess the capabilities that I'd been providing to Henderson Industries, probably hoping to win back the contract by promising faster results using resources they didn't actually have access to. Victoria, I need to ask direct. Has Stevens and Associates identified their senior partner with Indonesian connections, or are they being vague about their cultural expertise? Now that you mention it, they were surprisingly vague about personnel detail. They said they preferred not to discuss specific team members until after contract signing for competitive confidentiality reasons. I laughed out loud, drawing curious looks from passing pedestrians. Victoria, Stevens and Associates doesn't have established Indonesian business connection. They're trying to win back your contract by claiming capabilities they don't possess. How can you be so certain? Because the senior partner with Indonesian diplomatic experience and established business family relationships that they're probably referring to is me. I'm the person whose connections they're claiming to have access to. There was a long silence on the phone. You mean Stevens and Associates is trying to win our contract by promising access to your relationships without actually having secured your cooperation? That's exactly what they're doing. And it gets more interesting. Stevens and Associates is my husband's firm. David Brooks is the partner who lost your original contract to my cultural analysis. Your husband's firm is trying to steal our contract by claiming access to your expertise. My husband's firm is desperate enough to make promises they can't keep in hopes of recovering revenue they've lost to culturally competent competitors. Victoria was quiet for several moments, processing the implications. Natalie, this is unethical business behavior at best. At worst, it's fraudulent misrepresentation of capabilities. It's certainly not the foundation for the kind of trusted business relationships that successful Indonesian market entry requires. I agree. Henderson Industries needs partners who understand cultural protocols and relationship development. Stevens and Associates has just demonstrated that they understand neither. After hanging up with Victoria, I continued toward my next meeting while calling Margaret Walsh to inform her about Stevens and Associates' latest competitive strategy. They're claiming access to your Indonesian relationships. Margaret's voice rose with indignation. That's not just unethical, Natalie. That's potentially actionable misrepresentation. It's also completely characteristic of their approach to international business. I replied. David's firm operates under the assumption that business success is primarily about clever positioning rather than actual competence. What do you want to do about this? We could file a complaint with the Business Ethics Board, or we could simply let Henderson Industries know that Stevens and Associates can't deliver what they're promising. I considered Margaret's suggestions as I approached the Chen family's business complex. Let's document everything carefully and inform Henderson Industries about the misrepresentation. But I don't want to file formal complaints yet. I want to see how far David's firm is willing to go with promises they can't keep. The Chen family meeting proceeded even more successfully than the Soeharto introduction. Peter Chen, who managed the family's distribution networks throughout Southeast Asia, was immediately interested in Henderson Industries' manufacturing capabilities and impressed by their commitment to relationship-based market entry. American companies that understand patience and relationship investment succeed magnificently in our markets. Peter explained over traditional Indonesian lunch. Companies that demand immediate results fail consistently and expensive. Henderson Industries has analyzed their previous expansion failures and recognizes that aggressive timelines were primary contributing factors. I replied. They're prepared to invest whatever time relationship development requires. Peter smiled approvingly. This approach demonstrates wisdom and cultural respect. I would be honored to facilitate introductions with our retail partners and distribution associates. By the end of the day, I'd secured enthusiastic cooperation from 3 major Indonesian business families, each representing different aspects of market entry requirement, manufacturing partnerships, distribution networks, and retail relationships that would provide Henderson Industries with comprehensive market access based on established trust rather than aggressive salesmanship. That evening, I called Victoria Henderson from my hotel room to update her on the day's progress. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. We're ahead of schedule for relationship development, and the business families I've met with are genuinely excited about Henderson Industries' partnership approach. This is exactly what we hoped for when we chose Relationship First Consulting, Victoria replied. By the way, we declined Stevens and Associates' proposal this afternoon. Their claims about Indonesian connections seemed increasingly implausible as we compared them to your actual results. What was their response to the rejection? Disappointment followed by accusations that we were making a mistake by choosing cultural adaptation over efficiency. They seemed genuinely confused about why we preferred your approach to theirs. I wasn't surprised by Stevens and Associates' reaction. David's firm genuinely believed that business success was primarily about presentation and persuasion rather than cultural competence and relationship development. Their confusion about Henderson Industries' preferences reflected fundamental mental misunderstandings about international business requirements. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Stevens and Associates presented alternative proposal to Henderson today. Mark thinks we have good chance of winning contract back. Cultural expertise might be overrated. I stared at David's message, marveling at his continued inability to understand what had actually happened with Henderson Industries. His firm had just been rejected for making fraudulent claims about capabilities they didn't possess, and David was interpreting the situation as evidence that cultural expertise was overrated. I typed back, Henderson Industries declined Stevens & Associates' proposal this afternoon. They were not impressed by claims about Indonesian connections. David's response was immediate. How do you know Henderson declined our proposal? Because I'm in Jakarta building the relationships that Henderson Industries actually needs for successful market entry. The relationships that Stevens & Associates claim to have access to. My phone rang within minutes. David's voice was tight with frustration when I answered. Natalie, did you sabotage our Henderson proposal? I didn't sabotage anything, David. Stevens & Associates sabotaged themselves by making promises they couldn't keep about capabilities they don't possess. What capabilities? We offered Henderson Industries accelerated market entry using established business connections. Whose established business connections? Dave. Which Stevens & Associates partner has spent years developing relationships with Indonesian business families. There was a long silence. Mark said we could leverage your background if necessary. Leverage my background? David, your firm claimed to have capabilities that only I can provide, without bothering to confirm that I would actually provide them. That's not leveraging resources, that's fraudulent misrepresentation, but you're my wife. Surely your professional connections are available to support our business development. I took a deep breath, trying to control my response to David's staggering assumption. David, my professional relationships are not marital assets that you can claim for business purposes. These are connections I've built through years of cultural relationship development, and they're available exclusively to clients who understand and respect cultural protocols. So you're deliberately preventing Stevens & Associates from accessing opportunities that could save our business. I'm preventing Stevens & Associates from making promises they can't keep to clients who deserve honest representation. David, your firm just demonstrated exactly why you've been losing international contracts. You approach cultural relationships as resources to exploit rather than partnerships to develop. David was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of desperation that I'd never heard before. Natalie, Stevens & Associates is facing serious financial problems. We need international consulting capabilities to survive, and you're the only person who can provide them. David, I've offered to consider project-based consulting arrangements through international strategic solutions, but I won't allow my cultural relationships to be misrepresented or exploited by a firm that doesn't understand international business requirements. What would it take for you to help us directly, not as a consultant, but as a partner who wants to see the firm succeed? I looked out my hotel window at Jakarta's glittering nighttime skyline, thinking about David's question. It would take Stevens & Associates demonstrating genuine understanding of cultural relationship development, rather than continuing to approach international business as aggressive sales expansion. It would take acknowledging that successful international consulting requires completely different assumptions than domestic business development. We're prepared to change our approach based on your expertise. David, change requires more than preparedness. Change requires humility about what you don't know and patience for learning approaches that seem inefficient by American business standards. Is Stevens & Associates actually willing to spend months building relationships before expecting any revenue generation? If that's what success requires, then yes. Is Stevens & Associates willing to lose clients who want fast results rather than sustainable partnerships? That's a harder question to answer. I appreciated David's honesty about his firm's limitations. David, successful international consulting is fundamentally incompatible with aggressive revenue expectations and client demands for rapid results. Until Stevens & Associates understands this incompatibility, they're not ready for international business development. Then help us understand. Natalie, please, the firm can't survive without developing international capabilities, and I'm beginning to realize that I can't understand international business without learning from someone who actually knows these markets. For the first time in our marriage, David was asking for my professional expertise without dismissing its value or claiming superior practical knowledge. For the first time, he was acknowledging that his business success might depend on capabilities that I possessed, and he laughed. I'll consider consulting arrangements when I return from Jakarta, I said finally, but any partnership would require Stevens and Associates, accepting that I set cultural protocols and relationship development timeline. No aggressive sales strategies, no promises to clients about accelerated market entry, and no claims about capabilities without my explicit approval. Those terms are acceptable, David replied quickly. David, I'm not talking about terms for a business contract. I'm talking about fundamental changes to how Stevens and Associates approaches international consulting. Changes that would affect every client interaction and every project timeline. I understand, we're prepared to restructure our international approach based on your guidance. After hanging up with David, I sat in my hotel room, thinking about how dramatically our relationship dynamics had shifted over the past month. The husband who'd abandoned me at Denver International Airport because I'd forgotten my passport was now asking me to save his failing business using exactly the expertise he'd spent years dismissing as irrelevant. The woman who'd been stranded at airport security had been David's overlooked wife, whose academic credentials were interesting but impractical. The woman who'd just secured Henderson Industries' enthusiastic cooperation for Indonesian market entry was someone whose professional relationships could determine Stevens and Associates' survival. Tomorrow I would complete relationship development meetings that would establish Henderson Industries as a preferred American partner for 3 major Indonesian business families. Real partnerships based on cultural understanding and mutual respect, partnerships that would generate sustainable revenue for years, rather than quick profits that collapsed due to cultural insensitivity. Meanwhile, David would be in Denver trying to convince Stevens and Associates partners that their firm's survival depended on abandoning the aggressive sales approaches that had defined their business model since inception. His success would depend on his ability to persuade experienced business executives that cultural relationship development was more valuable than rapid revenue generation. Whether our marriage could survive the transition from dismissed wife to essential business partner remained unclear. But for the first time in 8 years, David was recognizing that his professional success might depend more on my expertise than on his assumptions about international business efficiency. The balance of power had shifted permanently, and both of us were still learning what that meant for our future together. 6 months after returning from Jakarta, I stood in the renovated conference room at Stevens and Associates, watching David present our latest international consulting success to a room full of potential clients. The space had been completely transformed since my partnership began, with cultural artifacts from our various international projects and a world map dotted with pins representing our growing network of global business relationships. The presentation David was delivering bore little resemblance to the aggressive sales pitches that had characterized Stevens and Associates' previous approach to international business. Instead, he was explaining the 18-month relationship development timeline required for sustainable market entry in Southeast Asian countries, emphasizing the importance of cultural preparation and family business protocols. Successful international expansion requires patience and cultural intelligence, David told the assembled executives from 3 different manufacturing companies. Quick market entry strategies consistently fail in relationship-based business cultures. Our approach prioritizes long-term partnership development over short-term revenue generation. I smiled from my position at the back of the room, remembering David's initial resistance to these exact principles 6 months ago. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Restructuring Stevens and Associates to prioritize cultural relationship development had required fundamental changes to their business model, client expectations, and revenue projections. The first month had been particularly challenging. 3 existing clients had terminated contracts when informed that accelerated international expansion timelines weren't culturally sustainable. Mark Stevens had initially balked at turning down business that promised quick profits, but delivered expensive failure. Several junior associates had struggled to adapt to consulting approaches that seemed inefficient by traditional American business standards. But the Henderson Industries' success had provided irrefutable evidence that relationship-first approaches generated superior results. Within 4 months of our Indonesian relationship development work, Henderson Industries had secured manufacturing partnerships with all three business families I'd introduced them to. Their Indonesian revenue was already exceeding projections, and they'd referred two other American companies to our cultural consulting services. More importantly, the Indonesian business families had begun introducing Henderson Industries to their networks throughout Southeast Asia. The initial 18-month investment in relationship development was generating expansion opportunities that would have taken years to develop through traditional sales approaches. David concluded his presentation by showing revenue comparisons between aggressive market entry strategies and relationship-based approaches. Cultural intelligence consulting requires longer initial timelines, but produces dramatically higher success rates and more sustainable partnerships. Companies that invest properly in relationship development typically see much stronger long-term returns than those that prioritize speed over cultural understanding. After the potential clients left, David approached me with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully navigated a complex professional challenge. "I think that went well." The manufacturing executive seemed genuinely interested in relationship-first approaches. "You presented the cultural intelligence principles very effectively," I replied. 6 months ago, you would have been promising them market entry within 8 months and dismissing relationship development as unnecessary delay. David nodded thoughtfully. 6 months ago, I didn't understand that international business success requires completely different assumptions than domestic consulting. I was approaching cultural differences as obstacles to overcome, rather than relationships to develop. The office around us buzzed with productive energy, as our expanded international consulting team prepared for various cultural relationship projects. We now employed 2 additional cultural specialists, a language coordinator, and a relationship development manager whose job was ensuring that all client interactions respected appropriate cultural protocol. Carmen appeared in the doorway of our conference room, carrying files for our upcoming project with Morrison Electronics, a company seeking to expand into Latin American markets. "Natalie, the Morrison executives want to accelerate their timeline for Mexico market entry. They're concerned that 18 months of relationship development is too conservative." I accepted the files, reviewing Morrison Electronics' previous failed expansion attempts. "Carmen, can you schedule a call with Morrison's leadership team for tomorrow? I need to explain why their Mexican expansion failed 3 years ago and how proper cultural preparation could have prevented those expensive mistakes." "Already scheduled for 2 o'clock, Carmen replied efficiently. "Also, Ambassador Williams called. She wants to discuss potential consulting opportunities with State Department trade missions." Patricia Williams had been following my transition from diplomatic service to private cultural consulting with great interest. Her recent inquiries suggested that government trade missions were recognizing the value of cultural intelligence services for American companies attempting international expansion. "Tell Patricia I'll call her Thursday morning," I said. "I'm curious about her trade mission idea." As Carmen left to make the arrangements, David turned to me with an expression of genuine gratitude. "Natalie, I need to acknowledge something I should have said months ago. Everything Stevens and Associates has accomplished this year is because of your expertise and relationship. The firm wouldn't have survived without your cultural intelligence capabilities." I studied David's face, recognizing sincerity rather than calculated flattery. "David, the firm's success comes from embracing approaches that prioritize cultural understanding over aggressive sales tactics. That change required significant courage from you and Mark. But the knowledge base, the relationships, the analytical framework for understanding international markets, all of that came from you. I spent 8 years living with someone whose expertise could have transformed our business capabilities, and I was too limited in my thinking to recognize what was right in front of me." This acknowledgement represented a level of professional humility that David had never demonstrated during our marriage. The man who'd abandoned me at Denver International Airport for forgetting my passport was now crediting his business survival to expertise he'd once dismissed as impractical academic theory. "David, what's important now is that Stevens and Associates understands how cultural intelligence consulting actually works. The firm has developed genuine capabilities, rather than just claiming competencies for competitive purposes." My phone buzzed with a call from Robert Henderson, whose enthusiasm for our consulting services had only grown as Henderson Industries' Indonesian partnerships flourished. "Natalie, I wanted to update you on our latest development. The Suharto family has introduced us to business contacts in Thailand and Vietnam. Our relationship-based approach is opening doors throughout Southeast Asia. That's exactly how cultural relationship networks function. Trust and partnership recommendations carry much more weight than cold sales approaches in family-oriented business cultures. We're ready to expand our consulting arrangement with Stevens & Associates. Robert continued. Henderson Industries wants to retain your firm for comprehensive Southeast Asian market development. We're prepared to commit to a 3-year partnership. After hanging up with Robert Henderson, I realized that Stevens & Associates had completely transformed from a struggling domestic consulting firm into a regionally recognized leader in cultural intelligence consulting. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been painless, but the results were undeniable. David's willingness to acknowledge his previous limitations and embrace fundamentally different approaches to international business had been essential for the firm's transformation. More importantly for our marriage, his recognition of my professional expertise had shifted our relationship dynamics from husband as primary breadwinner to genuine business partnership. That evening, David and I sat in our living room, reviewing expansion plans for Stevens & Associates' International Consulting Division. The conversation flowed with the kind of intellectual engagement that had characterized our early relationship but had disappeared during years of David dismissing my contribution. I've been thinking about Patricia Williams' trade mission proposal, David said, reviewing notes from our afternoon client meetings. Government trade missions could provide access to international markets that individual companies couldn't penetrate independently. Patricia's State Department connections would certainly open doors that private consulting firms can't access, I agreed. But trade mission consulting requires even more sophisticated cultural preparation than individual company projects. I smiled at David's question, remembering when he would have dismissed cultural preparation as unnecessary complication rather than asking for detailed explanation. Trade missions involve multiple American companies attempting to establish relationships simultaneously with foreign business community. Without proper cultural coordination, American companies can actually compete against each other in ways that damage everyone's relationship development opportunity. So, trade mission consulting requires managing cultural relationships for multiple clients simultaneously, while ensuring that their individual business development goals don't conflict with broader diplomatic objectives. It's cultural intelligence consulting at a much more complex level. David leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Natally, a year ago I would have assumed that business success was simply a matter of professional presentation and competitive position. I had no idea that cultural relationship management could be so strategically complex. Most American business executives make similar assumptions about international markets, I replied. That's why cultural intelligence consulting has become such a rapidly growing field. Companies are finally recognizing that cultural competence determines international success more than product quality or pricing strategy. My phone rang with a call from James Chen, whose partnership with Stevens & Associates had evolved into one of our most productive professional relationships. Natally, I wanted to congratulate you on the Morrison Electronics success. Word is spreading about Stevens & Associates' cultural intelligence capabilities. Morrison's willingness to invest properly in Mexican relationship development made all the difference, I replied. They understood that sustainable market entry required cultural preparation rather than aggressive sales tactics. Speaking of success stories, International Strategic Solutions has been approached by 2 Fortune 500 companies asking specifically for cultural consulting partnerships with Stevens & Associates. Your firm's reputation for relationship-based international development is attracting some very significant opportunity. After James hung up, I shared the conversation with David, whose expression reflected both pride and amazement at how quickly Stevens & Associates had become a recognized leader in cultural intelligence consulting. A year ago, we were struggling to understand why we kept losing international contracts to competitors with mysterious cultural expertise. David said, "Now we're the firm that other companies want to partner with for cultural intelligence capability." The transformation has been remarkable, I agreed, but it required Stevens & Associates accepting that successful international consulting demands completely different approaches than domestic business development. More than that, David replied thoughtfully. It required me accepting that my wife possessed expertise that I'd never bothered to understand or value. This acknowledgement touched on the deeper issues that had nearly destroyed our marriage long before the airport abandonment incident. David's dismissal of my professional background had reflected broader assumptions about whose knowledge mattered and whose contributions deserved recognition. David, what's changed isn't just your understanding of international business. What's changed is your willingness to recognize expertise that doesn't match your previous assumptions about what knowledge looks like. David nodded slowly. You're right. I spent years assuming that practical business experience was inherently more valuable than academic expertise and cultural knowledge. I never considered that successful international business might require exactly the kind of theoretical foundation that I'd dismissed as impractical. The next morning brought news that perfectly illustrated how dramatically our professional circumstances had changed. Margaret Walsh called with an opportunity that would have been unthinkable when I'd first joined International Strategic Solutions 8 months early. Natalie, the State Department has requested proposals for a comprehensive cultural intelligence training program for American companies participating in Asian trade missions. They want Stevens and Associates to lead the project. I almost dropped my coffee cup. The State Department wants Stevens and Associates to develop cultural training programs for government trade missions. Patricia Williams specifically requested your firm based on the Henderson Industries success and the Morrison Electronics result. She said that Stevens and Associates has demonstrated exactly the kind of cultural intelligence capabilities that American trade missions need. This opportunity represented recognition at the highest levels of American international business development. Government trade missions could expose Stevens and Associates to hundreds of potential clients while establishing our firm as the premier cultural intelligence consulting service for American companies pursuing international expansion. Margaret, this project would require developing training programs for multiple industries and cultural contexts simultaneously. It's significantly more complex than individual company consulting. That's exactly why the State Department wants Stevens and Associates leading the project. They need cultural intelligence consulting that can scale from individual company needs to comprehensive trade mission coordination. I called David immediately to discuss the State Department opportunity. His excitement was obvious even over the phone. Natalie, this could establish Stevens and Associates as the definitive authority on American international business cultural preparation. It could also overwhelm our current capabilities if we're not prepared for the complexity. I caution. Government trade mission consulting requires cultural expertise at levels we haven't attempted yet. What would we need to handle this kind of project? I pulled out my notepad, beginning to sketch the requirements for comprehensive trade mission cultural intelligence consulting. We'd need to expand our cultural specialist team, develop training programs for multiple industries simultaneously, and create coordination systems for managing dozens of client companies within single trade missions. But it's feasible if we're willing to invest significantly in capability development before committing to deliverables. This isn't the kind of project where we can learn as we go. That afternoon, David, Mark Stevens and I met to discuss whether Stevens and Associates was ready for the State Department opportunity. The conversation reflected how completely the firm's approach to business development had transformed over the past 8 months. 8 months ago, we would have committed to this project immediately and figured out the capabilities afterward, Mark observed. Now we're actually analyzing whether we can deliver what we promise before making commitment. That change in approach is exactly why we're being considered for State Department work, I replied. Cultural intelligence consulting requires honest assessment of capabilities, rather than optimistic promises about accelerated timelines. David leaned forward with interest. Natalie, assuming we decide to pursue this opportunity, what would Stevens and Associates need to become genuinely capable of trade mission cultural coordination? I opened my laptop and showed them the preliminary analysis I'd been developing. We'd need to hire 4 additional cultural specialists with expertise in different regional markets. We'd need to develop standardized training programs that could be customized for different industries and cultural content. Most importantly, we'd need to establish relationships with foreign government trade officials who coordinate international business development from their country's perspectives. That sounds like a massive expansion of our current operations, Mark said. It is a massive expansion, but the State Department project would provide revenue stability for developing these capabilities sustainably, rather than growing too quickly and compromising service quality. David studied my analysis carefully. How long would capability development require before we could begin delivering trade mission services? 6 months for comprehensive preparation, assuming we begin hiring and training immediately. The State Department timeline allows for 8 months of development before the first trade mission cultural coordination project. Mark nodded approvingly. So we'd have adequate time for proper preparation, rather than rushing into commitments we can't fulfill. Exactly. And the capability development would position Stevens and Associates for additional government consulting opportunities that individual company projects can't provide access to. After the meeting, David and I drove home together discussing the implications of expanding Stevens and Associates into government trade mission consulting. The conversation felt like a genuine business partnership between equals, rather than the one-sided dynamics that had characterized our marriage for so many years. Natalie, I need to ask something that's been on my mind since we started working together professionally, David said as we reached our driveway. Are you genuinely satisfied with how our relationship has evolved? Or are you still resentful about the years when I didn't value your expertise? I considered David's question carefully as we walked into our house. David, I'm satisfied with where we are now, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten where we came from. Your dismissal of my professional background damaged our marriage in ways that professional success can't completely repair. What would complete repair look like? Complete repair would require you understanding not just that my expertise is valuable, but why your previous dismissal was so harmful. It wasn't just about missing business opportunity. It was about treating me as less intelligent and less capable than I actually am. David sat down heavily in his chair, processing what I'd told him. You're saying that my business assumptions reflected deeper problems with how I viewed you as a person. Your business assumptions reflected deeper problems with how you viewed expertise that didn't match your preconceptions about what knowledge looks like. My background didn't fit your model of practical business experience, so you dismissed it as irrelevant academic theory. And that dismissal made you feel like I didn't respect your intelligence or capabilities. That dismissal made me feel like you'd married someone you didn't actually understand or value. The airport abandonment was just the culmination of years of being treated as less competent than I. David was quiet for several minutes, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his expression was more serious than I'd seen in months. Natalie, I don't know how to undo the damage from years of not recognizing who you actually are, but I want you to know that working with you professionally has completely changed how I understand both business success and personal relationships. How so? I understand now that real partnership requires recognizing and valuing what the other person brings, rather than assuming that your own perspective is automatically superior. I understand that dismissing expertise I don't personally possess was both professionally stupid and personally destructive. This level of self-awareness represented growth that went far beyond David's professional recognition of my cultural intelligence capability. He was acknowledging fundamental flaws in how he'd approached our marriage and his assumptions about whose knowledge mattered. David, that understanding is exactly what our relationship needed for so many years. The professional success is wonderful, but the personal recognition matters more. Does this mean you're willing to consider our marriage genuinely repaired, rather than just professionally functional? I looked at my husband, recognizing someone who'd learned to value capabilities he'd previously dismissed, and acknowledge assumptions that had damaged both his business and his marriage. David, our marriage is better now than it's been in years. Whether it's genuinely repaired depends on whether these changes in understanding and behavior are permanent, rather than temporary responses to professional necessity. They're permanent, David said firmly. Not because of professional necessity, but because I finally understand what I was too limited to recognize before. 3 weeks later, I stood in the departure lounge at Denver International Airport, preparing to board a State Department trade mission flight to Singapore. The same airport where David had abandoned me 8 months earlier had become the starting point for the most significant professional opportunity of my career. David stood beside me, no longer as my dismissive husband, but as my business partner and equal collaborator in cultural intelligence consulting. Stevens and Associates had won the State Department contract and was about to begin comprehensive trade mission coordination services that would establish our firm as the premier authority on American international business cultural preparation. I still can't believe how completely everything has changed since that morning when I left you at security, David said, watching our departure gate information update on the monitor. Everything changed because I finally stopped accepting your limitations as definitions of my capabilities, I replied. The expertise was always there. What changed was my willingness to use it regardless of whether you valued it, and my willingness to recognize it regardless of whether it matched my preconceptions about what business knowledge looks like. As boarding began for the State Department flight, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in less than a year. The woman who'd been stranded at airport security had been David's overlooked wife, whose forgotten passport was evidence of feminine incompetence. The woman boarding a diplomatic flight to lead government trade mission cultural coordination was someone whose expertise had saved David's business and transformed their marriage into genuine partnership. Ready to show the State Department what cultural intelligence consulting can accomplish? David asked as we joined the boarding line. Ready to show them what happens when American companies approach international markets with proper cultural preparation rather than aggressive sales assumptions, I replied. Walking through the diplomatic boarding area, I smiled at the symmetry of returning to the same airport where my transformation had begun. The abandoned wife at security had been a temporary role forced on me by David's dismissive assumption. The international cultural consultant boarding a government trade mission was who I'd always been capable of becoming when my expertise was valued rather than dismissed. As our plane lifted off from Denver International Airport, beginning the journey toward what would become the most successful trade mission cultural coordination project in State Department history, I realized that sometimes the most devastating betrayals create opportunities for the most meaningful transformation. David's abandonment at airport security had forced me to remember what I was capable of accomplishing when my expertise was recognized rather than dismissed. His firm's desperate need for cultural intelligence capabilities had created space for genuine partnership based on mutual respect rather than assumed superiority. The woman who'd been left behind at security had finally stopped waiting for permission to use her capabilities and had started using them, regardless of whether others understood their value. The results spoke for themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.